Hey guys, tonight we're looking at one of the least glamorous parts of medieval life and one of the most revealing. A society can build cathedrals, raise castles, write laws, and wage wars, but in the end it still has to solve the same basic problem every human community faces. And in the Middle Ages, that simple daily necessity exposed the real differences between rich and poor, town and countryside, comfort and disease. Before we get into it, if you enjoy calm, thoughtful history like this, consider subscribing. A lot of regular viewers do, simply so they can keep finding these long-form stories when they need something steady, interesting, and worth listening to. Now, with that said, let's step quietly into medieval Europe and look at how people use toilets in a world without modern plumbing. The first thing to understand is that there was no single medieval toilet. The Middle Ages lasted roughly 1,000 years, and people lived in very different conditions depending on whether they were peasants in the countryside, merchants in crowded towns, monks in monasteries, or nobles inside fortified castles. So when people imagine one standard medieval bathroom, they usually miss the reality. What existed instead was a whole range of practical solutions. Simple pits, wooden privies, communal latrines, chamber pots, and in more elaborate settings, built-in stone toilet shafts known as garderobes. Medieval people did not ignore sanitation. They managed it with the materials, architecture, and habits available to them, and those methods tell us a great deal about how medieval life was organized. For ordinary rural households, the experience was usually the simplest. Many peasants lived in small timber homes with earth floors, shared space with animals, and had little privacy by modern standards. A dedicated indoor toilet would have been unusual. Instead, people often used a basic outdoor privy, a pit dug at some distance from the house, or simply went in a designated area beyond the dwelling and fields. At night, in bad weather, or for the elderly and sick, chamber pots were a practical alternative. These were then emptied later, sometimes into pits, middens, or waste heaps. This sounds crude, and by modern expectations it certainly was, but it was also logical. In a low-density village, where people lived close to open land and where waste could be separated from the living area more easily than in a city, a simple solution often worked well enough. Medieval hygiene was not based on modern plumbing, but that did not mean people had no standards at all. Clean hands, washing from basins, and basic routines of bodily care still mattered, even in modest households. Towns were a very different matter. As medieval cities grew, the toilet problem became more difficult and much more dangerous. A crowded place like late medieval London or Paris concentrated people, animals, workshops, markets, and waste inside tight urban spaces. Here, chamber pots and privies still existed, but disposal became the central problem. Many houses had cesspits beneath or beside them, designed to collect human waste until it could be removed. Some towns also had public latrines, and these were sometimes built to serve multiple users at once, which reminds us that medieval privacy was not the same as ours. But cesspits could overflow, leak, or contaminate nearby wells if badly placed or poorly maintained. Urban authorities understood at least part of this danger. Medieval towns issued sanitation rules, tried to regulate dumping, and sometimes punished people for throwing waste into streets or waterways. These efforts were uneven and enforcement was imperfect, but they show that medieval governments were not indifferent. They knew filth threatened comfort, order, and health, even if they did not yet possess a modern scientific understanding of germs. Inside castles, the solution was more sophisticated, though not always more pleasant. The most famous medieval castle toilet was the garderobe, a small privy chamber built into the thickness of a wall or projecting slightly outward from it. A stone or wooden seat sat above a vertical chute, and the waste dropped down the outside wall into a pit, or in some cases toward a moat or drainage area. The design was efficient because it used gravity and architecture rather than water pressure. It also kept the most unpleasant part of the process away from the main halls and living chambers. But castle toilets were not luxurious in the modern sense. They could be cold, exposed to drafts, and strongly affected by weather and smell. Builders sometimes placed them where air currents might carry odors away, but comfort had limits. Even so, the presence of these structures shows us that elite households invested real thought in sanitation. A large residence housing nobles, servants, guards, and guests needed regular waste removal just as surely as it needed kitchens and wells. In some places, the ammonia smell associated with these privies may even have helped discourage insects in nearby storage spaces, which partly explains the old link between the word garderobe and the storage of clothing, though historians are careful not to turn that into a neat universal rule. Monasteries offer one of the clearest examples of medieval toilet planning because they were disciplined communities built around routine. In many monasteries, the latrine block, often called the necessarium or later the reredorer, was placed with remarkable care. It was usually attached near the dormitory and arranged so that many monks could use it in an orderly fashion. Some were built above flowing water or drainage channels, allowing current to carry waste away more effectively than a stagnant pit could. This was not accidental. Monastic life depended on schedules, rules, and architecture designed to support them. If dozens of men were rising together, praying together, eating together, and sleeping together, sanitation had to be reliable. Plans such as the famous monastic layouts associated with St. Gall show just how deliberately medieval religious communities thought about functions that modern people often assume were ignored. A monastery, in other words, was not only a place of prayer. It was also a highly organized machine for daily living, and toilets were part of that machine. Then there is the question almost everyone asks: what did people use instead of toilet paper? The answer varies and often depends on class, region, and what materials were nearby. In many places, people likely used handfuls of straw, hay, moss, rags, or other disposable organic matter. Water could also be used for washing, especially where it was readily available. There was no single medieval equivalent of a standardized paper roll waiting in every privy. The wider point is that medieval toilet use was less about one universal object and more about adaptation. People relied on materials at hand and on habits passed down through custom. This practical improvisation shaped the entire experience of medieval sanitation. Toilets were not separate, sealed spaces disconnected from the wider environment. They were part of household management, labor, and local ecology. Even the act of emptying waste became a job in itself. In some later medieval and early modern towns, Specialized workers were employed to clear cesspits, often at night, doing work that was unpleasant but absolutely necessary for urban life to continue. What all of this reveals is that medieval toilet use was less primitive than many modern people assume, but also much more fragile. The system worked only when settlement size, architecture, labor, and maintenance remained in balance. In a small village, distance and open ground made simple disposal possible. In a monastery, order and planning made communal sanitation manageable. In a castle, stone engineering provided a durable answer for elites. But in a growing town where population could outstrip infrastructure, the weaknesses became obvious. Smell, seepage, contamination, and crowding were not side issues. They were central facts of urban life. This is one reason sanitation history matters so much. It shows us where medieval institutions were capable and where they were strained. It also reminds us that public health did not suddenly appear in the modern world from nowhere. Long before modern sewer systems, medieval communities were already wrestling with the same broad challenge: how to live together in large numbers without being overwhelmed by their own waste. And perhaps that is the real story here. Medieval toilets were not just embarrassing corners hidden behind castle walls or down dark alleyways. They were a daily test of how society functioned. They reflected class, because nobles could afford stone-built privies while the poor relied on simpler means. They reflected discipline, because monasteries integrated sanitation into routine life. And they reflected the growth of medieval Europe itself, especially as towns became richer, denser, and harder to keep clean. If you want to understand a civilization honestly, you have to look not only at its crowns, manuscripts, and cathedrals, but also at its drains, pits, and latrines. Because it is often in those ordinary places, not the grand ones, that the structure of life becomes easiest to see. So the next time medieval history is reduced to armor, kings, and battles, it is worth remembering this quieter reality. Every day, beneath the pageantry and the stone, people were still managing water, waste, smell, privacy, labor, and disease with the tools they had. And in that sense, the medieval toilet is not a strange side note at all. It is one of the clearest windows we have into how the Middle Ages actually worked. One of the most interesting aspects of medieval sanitation is how closely it was tied to architecture. In modern homes, toilets are hidden behind plumbing systems that most people rarely think about. But in the Middle Ages, waste management had to be built directly into the physical design of buildings. Castles, monasteries, and even some townhouses were carefully planned with small chambers, shafts, or extensions specifically intended for this purpose. The location of these spaces mattered. Builders often placed them along outer walls so gravity could carry waste downward and away from the main structure. In large stone castles, this sometimes meant that a narrow vertical chute ran down through the wall, ending at ground level outside the fortification. These castle garderobes could be surprisingly common. A large fortress housing dozens or even hundreds of people might include several of them placed in different towers or corridors. Some were positioned near sleeping chambers, others near guard posts, allowing soldiers on duty to use them without leaving their stations. Archaeological studies of medieval castles across England and France show that the designers clearly understood the importance of separating living areas from waste areas as much as possible. Even though the technology was simple, the principle was sound. Distance, airflow, and gravity were the primary tools medieval builders used to control smell and contamination. But these systems were far from perfect. If a castle was built on rock, the waste might accumulate at the base of the wall until servants periodically removed it. In other locations, pits were dug below the chute to collect the material. Over time, these pits could fill, requiring workers to shovel out the contents. This unpleasant labor was an unavoidable part of maintaining a large residence. Historical records occasionally mention servants responsible for cleaning latrines, reminding us that behind every impressive castle hall stood a workforce performing difficult, often invisible tasks. Castles also reveal another interesting detail about medieval life. Privacy was limited. Many garderobes were extremely small, sometimes little more than a stone seat inside a narrow alcove. They were functional rather than comfortable. Some did not even have doors, only curtains or simple partitions. In a society where families, servants, and guards shared close quarters, personal space was simply not the same concept it is today. In towns, however, the sanitation problem grew much more complicated. As trade expanded during the High Middle Ages, cities across Europe began to swell with merchants, craftsmen, laborers, and travelers. Houses stood closer together, streets narrowed, and open land disappeared. Under these crowded conditions, managing waste became one of the greatest urban challenges. Many homes built cesspits beneath their floors or courtyards. These pits collected human waste and household refuse, slowly filling over months or years. Eventually, the pits had to be emptied, and this job fell to specialized workers, sometimes called night soil collectors. They often worked after dark, both to avoid the worst of the smell during busy daytime hours and to reduce public embarrassment. Using buckets and carts, they removed the contents of cesspits and carried them outside city limits. Although unpleasant, this work was vital for keeping towns habitable. Without it, waste would quickly accumulate and contaminate wells or nearby streams. City governments attempted to regulate these practices. Medieval municipal records from places like London show rules forbidding residents from dumping waste directly into the streets or rivers. Some regulations required homeowners to maintain their cesspits properly or face fines. These laws were not always followed, but they demonstrate an awareness that sanitation was a shared responsibility. The streets themselves often reflected the limits of these systems. Rainwater helped wash away some refuse, but during dry periods the smells could become overwhelming. Travelers and chroniclers occasionally described medieval towns as noisy, crowded, and filled with strong odors. Yet it would be wrong to assume people simply tolerated filth without concern. Complaints about waste appear frequently in historical documents, suggesting that medieval citizens were just as aware of the problem as we would be today. Another place where medieval sanitation developed in surprisingly organized ways was within monasteries. Religious communities often housed dozens, sometimes hundreds, of monks or nuns living together under strict daily routines. Because their lives followed a schedule of prayers, meals, work, and rest, the buildings themselves were designed carefully to support those routines. Sanitation could not be left to improvisation. It had to function reliably every day. Most large monasteries included a communal latrine structure known as a reredorer. Unlike the cramped garderobes found in castles, these were often longer rooms containing multiple toilet seats arranged side by side. Beneath the seats ran a drainage channel designed to carry waste away from the building. In some monasteries, this channel was supplied with a constant flow of water from a nearby stream or diverted channel. The flowing water helped move waste away from the structure and reduced odor. In effect, this was a simple but early form of a flushing system, achieved not through plumbing pipes but through clever use of gravity and natural water sources. Architects placed these latrine blocks strategically. They were commonly attached to the dormitory where monks slept, allowing easy access at night without requiring individuals to leave the enclosed monastery grounds. This design balanced convenience with sanitation. Waste remained separated from the main cloister and dining hall, while still being close enough for practical daily use. What is remarkable is how systematic this planning could be. Surviving monastic plans, such as the famous early medieval plan of St. Gall, show detailed layouts where kitchens, gardens, water supplies, and latrines were all carefully arranged in relation to each other. The monks understood that a healthy community required thoughtful infrastructure. Even without knowledge of bacteria or modern medical science, they recognized that stagnant waste and contaminated water caused illness and discomfort. Of course, these systems still depended on regular maintenance. Drainage channels could clog, pits could overflow, and water supplies could change depending on weather or seasonal conditions. Monasteries therefore assigned labor to ensure these systems continued to function. Cleaning, repairing, and inspecting sanitation structures became part of the practical work that supported monastic life. Beyond monasteries and castles, another everyday object shaped how medieval people handled their basic needs: the chamber pot. For many households, particularly in colder climates or dense urban environments, it was simply impractical to walk outside during the night. A chamber pot offered a solution. These containers were usually made from ceramic, metal, or sometimes wood, and were kept in sleeping areas for convenience. In the morning, the contents needed to be emptied. In rural areas, this might mean carrying the pot to a pit or compost area away from the house. In towns, the situation was more complicated. Some households emptied chamber pots into cesspits within their property. Others disposed of waste in designated dumping areas outside the city walls. There is also a persistent story that medieval residents simply threw the contents of chamber pots directly into the streets while shouting warnings to passers-by. While this sometimes happened, especially in crowded areas, it was not the normal or encouraged practice. Many cities had regulations against such behavior, and repeated offenses could result in fines. Urban authorities understood that waste accumulating in the streets created health problems and damaged the reputation of the town as a place for trade. Another interesting question concerns personal cleaning. Without modern toilet paper, medieval people relied on materials that were easy to find and dispose of. In rural environments, this might include grass, hay, moss, or leaves. In some regions, scraps of cloth or wool could also be used. Wealthier households might have had access to softer fabrics or sponges, though such items required washing and reuse. Water itself also played an important role. Washing with water was common in many cultures throughout history, and medieval Europe was no exception. Basins, jugs, and buckets allowed people to rinse hands and sometimes clean themselves more thoroughly after using the latrine. Cleanliness was not ignored. It simply relied on different tools and routines than those we use today. These details might seem small, but they reveal something important about medieval life. Sanitation was not an afterthought. It was woven into architecture, labor systems, household routines, and urban law. The methods may appear primitive compared with modern plumbing, but they represent practical solutions developed within the limits of medieval technology. Understanding these systems also helps explain why sanitation improved slowly over time. As towns expanded and populations grew larger, the traditional methods that once worked for small communities began to struggle under the pressure of density. Cesspits filled faster, wells became more vulnerable to contamination, and streets became harder to keep clean. In this way, the humble medieval toilet becomes more than just a curiosity. It reveals the challenges of managing daily life in a growing civilization, long before the arrival of modern sewers, pipes, and treatment systems that we now take for granted. As medieval towns continued to grow during the later Middle Ages, sanitation gradually became a matter not only of household responsibility but also of public concern. Local authorities began to recognize that waste management affected everyone in the community. If one household neglected its cesspit or dumped refuse into the street, the consequences could spread far beyond a single property. Smells, insects, and contaminated water could quickly affect entire neighborhoods. For this reason, city governments increasingly introduced rules aimed at maintaining cleaner streets and safer living conditions. In London, for example, municipal records from the 14th and 15th centuries show repeated attempts to control waste disposal. Residents were sometimes forbidden from throwing refuse into the River Thames or leaving waste piles along major roads. Officials known as wardens or inspectors were occasionally appointed to monitor sanitation practices in certain districts. Although enforcement varied, the existence of these regulations shows that medieval urban communities were actively thinking about cleanliness and public health. Markets were another area where sanitation required careful management. Medieval towns often depended on busy market squares where food, livestock, and goods were traded daily. These areas could quickly become dirty if animal waste, spoiled food, and human refuse accumulated together. To prevent this, towns sometimes required regular street cleaning or organized teams of workers to remove debris. Rain helped wash away some of the waste, but manual cleaning remained essential for keeping these spaces usable. Water sources were particularly important. Many medieval towns relied on wells or public fountains for drinking water. If cesspits were placed too close to these sources, there was a risk that contaminated water could seep into the supply. Although medieval people did not yet understand bacteria, they had observed that foul water often led to illness. As a result, some towns established rules about where pits and waste dumps could be located. Maintaining a clean water supply became one of the most critical aspects of urban planning. Even so, sanitation problems never disappeared entirely. In crowded cities, the systems available were often pushed beyond their limits. Heavy rains could flood cesspits and spread waste into nearby streets. During warm seasons, smells intensified and insects multiplied. Travelers visiting large medieval cities sometimes described the environment as noisy, busy, and filled with strong odors that reflected the realities of pre-modern urban life. Despite these difficulties, people adapted in practical ways. Households developed routines for cleaning living spaces, emptying waste containers, and maintaining pits or privies. Craftsmen and laborers created tools and services that helped manage these tasks. Night soil collectors, street sweepers, and waste carriers formed part of the unseen workforce that supported daily urban life. It is also worth remembering that medieval attitudes toward cleanliness were shaped by cultural beliefs as well as practical needs. Personal washing, hand cleaning, and bathing were valued in many communities, even if they were practiced differently from modern habits. Bathhouses existed in some cities, offering places where people could wash more thoroughly. While these establishments served social and commercial purposes as well, they remind us that medieval people did care about bodily hygiene. The broader lesson is that medieval sanitation was not static. Over centuries, communities experimented with different approaches to managing waste. Some methods proved effective for small populations but struggled as cities expanded. Others, such as the use of running water in monastic latrines, hinted at more advanced systems that would later evolve into the complex sewer networks of modern cities. Looking back, the medieval toilet might appear simple or even crude by today's standards. Yet it represented a practical response to one of the most basic challenges of human settlement. Every household, castle, monastery, and marketplace had to solve the same problem in its own way. Through pits, privies, drainage channels, and daily routines, medieval society created a system that, while imperfect, allowed communities to function for centuries. And in understanding these quiet, ordinary structures, we gain a clearer picture of everyday life in the Middle Ages. Behind the grand stories of kings and battles were millions of ordinary people managing the practical realities of living together in towns, villages, and fortresses. Their solutions to sanitation were not glamorous, but they were essential. Without them, medieval society could not have endured. Another important detail about medieval sanitation is how closely it was connected to the natural environment. In a world without underground sewer systems, waste had to return to the landscape in some form. Medieval communities often relied on distance, soil absorption, and natural decomposition to manage what their buildings produced. In rural areas, this process could actually work reasonably well. A pit dug far from the house allowed waste to break down gradually in the soil. Over time, the pit could be covered and a new one dug nearby. This simple cycle relied on space, something villages usually had in abundance. In fact, some forms of waste were even reused in practical ways. Human and animal waste could contribute to fertilizing fields, especially when mixed with other organic materials like straw or food scraps. Farmers understood that soil enriched with organic matter produced better crops. Although the process was not always controlled with modern scientific precision, The basic idea of recycling waste back into the agricultural system existed long before modern composting techniques. The situation in cities, however, remained far more complicated. As populations increased, the balance between waste production and natural absorption became harder to maintain. The limited space inside city walls meant that pits and dump sites were often closer to homes than anyone would have preferred. This created a constant need for removal and transport. Waste had to be carried outside the city where it could be disposed of or used in farming areas nearby. Transporting this material was difficult work. Workers used carts, barrels, and buckets to move waste away from dense neighborhoods. The smell alone made the job unpleasant, and the risk of spills or accidents was always present. Because of these conditions, the task was often done late at night or early in the morning when streets were quieter. Over time, the phrase night soil became associated with this collected waste, highlighting the connection between sanitation labor and the darker hours of the day. Architecture sometimes tried to help solve these problems by placing toilets in locations where natural elements could assist with disposal. In castles built near rivers or cliffs, garderobe shafts were occasionally positioned so that waste dropped into fast-moving water or into areas where rain could wash it away. While this reduced the need for manual cleaning, it also risked polluting nearby waterways. Medieval builders were often balancing convenience with environmental consequences they only partially understood. Weather played a surprisingly large role as well. Heavy rain could flush away surface waste, but might also flood cesspits, spreading contamination into streets or courtyards. Dry seasons created the opposite problem. Without rain to dilute odors or wash away debris, smells could linger and insects could multiply. These natural cycles meant that sanitation conditions in medieval towns could change dramatically depending on the season. Daily routines adapted to these environmental realities. Households learned when to empty chamber pots, where to place waste piles, and how to keep living areas as clean as possible. Simple actions such as sweeping floors, washing hands, and maintaining distance between wells and pits were small but meaningful steps in reducing unpleasant conditions. Interestingly, archaeological discoveries have provided modern historians with valuable insights into these practices. Excavations of medieval cesspits often reveal layers of preserved material including seeds, bones, fragments of cloth, and even traces of food that passed through the digestive system. These findings allow researchers to reconstruct aspects of medieval diets, trade, and daily life with surprising accuracy. What once seemed like simple waste has become a record of historical information. Through these discoveries, we see that medieval sanitation systems were not random or careless. They were practical solutions developed within the limits of available technology. People used gravity, water flow, soil, and human labor to manage waste in ways that allowed communities to survive and grow. In many ways, these systems represent the early stages of urban infrastructure. They show societies beginning to understand that large populations required organized approaches to sanitation. While medieval towns did not yet possess the engineering knowledge needed for modern sewer systems, their experiments and regulations laid the groundwork for later developments. By the end of the Middle Ages, European cities were slowly moving toward more structured approaches to urban management. Streets were sometimes widened, drainage channels improved, and waste removal systems gradually expanded. These changes were small compared with modern sanitation networks, but they marked an important step forward. And so, when we look back at how people used toilets in medieval times, we see more than a simple curiosity about the past. We see a civilization learning, adapting, and experimenting with the everyday challenges of living together. The solutions may seem modest today, but they represent the foundation upon which later generations would build the sanitation systems that now shape modern urban life. As the Middle Ages moved into the later centuries, another subtle change began to appear in the way European communities thought about cleanliness and waste. Population growth, expanding trade networks, and the steady development of towns meant that sanitation was no longer just a private household concern. It was becoming something that entire communities had to manage together. The larger a settlement became, the more obvious it was that waste could not simply be ignored or pushed aside. It had to be organized, monitored, and removed with increasing care. This gradual shift can be seen in the growing attention given to street maintenance. In many medieval towns, the responsibility for keeping streets reasonably clean often fell on the residents who lived along them. Homeowners might be required to sweep the section of road directly outside their house. Market vendors could be ordered to clear away spoiled food or animal remains at the end of the trading day. These tasks were not glamorous, but they were necessary to keep busy streets usable for carts, horses, and pedestrians. Drainage was another important feature of medieval urban design. Many streets were built with a slight slope toward a shallow gutter running down the center or along one side. Rainwater could flow along this channel, carrying away smaller debris and helping prevent puddles from forming. While these gutters were far from perfect sanitation systems, they represented an early attempt to manage water and waste together within the urban landscape. Over time, some towns began to build more permanent drainage structures using stone or brick. These channels directed wastewater away from populated areas toward rivers or open land beyond the city walls. Although the goal was mainly to keep streets passable rather than to create modern sewer systems, the idea of guiding waste through controlled pathways marked an important development in urban planning. At the same time, medieval society maintained a strong awareness of smell. In an age before scientific knowledge of bacteria or viruses, foul odors were often associated with sickness. Many people believed that unhealthy air, sometimes called miasma, could spread disease. As a result, bad smells were taken seriously. Removing waste, cleaning streets, and maintaining distance between living spaces and latrines were all seen as ways to improve the air and protect public health. This belief also influenced how buildings were arranged. In wealthier homes, kitchens, storage rooms, and privies were often separated from main living spaces whenever possible. Ventilation mattered. Windows, open courtyards, and airflow through corridors helped disperse odors that might otherwise linger in enclosed areas. Even if medieval builders did not understand microbes, they clearly understood that fresh air made living conditions more comfortable. Travelers visiting medieval towns frequently commented on these details. Some described the impressive organization of large markets, the careful placement of wells, or the presence of public fountains supplying clean water. Others noted the smells and crowded conditions that inevitably appeared in busy urban centers. Both perspectives reveal the same truth. Medieval cities were complex places, constantly balancing growth with the practical limits of their sanitation systems. Meanwhile, daily habits inside homes continued to evolve. Families developed routines around washing hands before meals, cleaning cooking tools, and maintaining living areas. Wooden buckets, ceramic basins, and cloth towels were common household items used for washing. Even small acts like these helped reduce the spread of dirt and odors in tightly shared living spaces. Another interesting feature of medieval sanitation is how it intersected with social hierarchy. The wealthy could afford better-built houses with private privies or enclosed courtyards, offering a degree of separation from waste. Poorer residents, especially those living in crowded districts or rented rooms, often relied on shared facilities or public latrines. This difference did not eliminate sanitation problems for the rich, but it did create noticeable contrasts in comfort and convenience. Over time, these contrasts encouraged further experimentation with urban infrastructure. Cities that wished to attract merchants, craftsmen, and travelers had a practical incentive to keep their streets functional and their water supplies reliable. Clean markets meant safer food. Clear roads meant smoother trade. In this way, sanitation quietly supported the economic life of medieval towns. Looking back, the medieval toilet may still seem like a small detail in the grand sweep of history. Yet it reflects a deeper process unfolding across centuries. As communities grew larger and more interconnected, people slowly began to recognize that managing waste was not just an individual responsibility but a shared challenge. Each pit, gutter, privy, and drainage channel represented an attempt, sometimes imperfect, sometimes surprisingly effective, to meet that challenge. By examining these everyday systems, historians gain a clearer view of medieval society not just as a world of castles and battles, but as a living network of households, workers, builders, and planners all trying to make daily life manageable. And it is within these quiet routines, emptying a chamber pot, cleaning a street, digging a new pit, that we see the foundations of the urban sanitation systems that would eventually transform cities in the centuries to come. One of the final pieces of the medieval sanitation story involves how knowledge slowly accumulated through experience. Medieval communities did not possess microscopes, germ theory, or modern medical science. Yet people were constantly observing patterns in everyday life. They noticed when water tasted strange, when wells became foul, or when certain places produced stronger odors than others. Over generations, these observations influenced how towns were built and how waste was managed. For example, many communities gradually learned that water sources had to be protected. Wells were often placed carefully within courtyards or near central squares where they could be monitored. In some towns, rules were introduced forbidding certain activities near drinking water supplies. Dumping refuse, washing animals, or emptying waste too close to wells could bring penalties. Even without a scientific explanation, experience had shown that protecting water meant fewer illnesses and a healthier population. Guilds and trades also played a role in shaping sanitation practices. Craftsmen such as tanners, butchers, and dyers often produced strong-smelling waste as part of their work. These trades were sometimes located along the edges of towns or near rivers where their waste could be carried away more easily. Separating these industries from residential areas helped reduce the impact on everyday living spaces. This arrangement reveals a growing awareness that certain activities needed distance to prevent discomfort or contamination. Medieval bridges and riverside areas also reveal interesting sanitation strategies. In some cities, public latrines were built directly over running water so the current would carry waste away downstream. The famous London Bridge, for instance, had structures projecting outward where waste could drop directly into the River Thames. While this solution kept streets cleaner, it also contributed to pollution of the river itself. For medieval people, however, the flowing water seemed like a natural method of removal, especially in large cities where alternatives were limited. Another factor shaping sanitation was the constant movement of people. Medieval towns attracted merchants, pilgrims, laborers, and travelers from distant regions. Inns and taverns needed facilities for guests, which meant additional waste management challenges. Some larger inns included shared privies in courtyards, while others relied on nearby public latrines. The constant turnover of visitors meant these spaces required frequent cleaning and maintenance. Festivals and market days could temporarily multiply a town's population, creating sudden pressure on sanitation systems. Crowds gathered for trading fairs, religious celebrations, or seasonal events, filling streets with people and animals. During these busy periods, managing waste became especially difficult. Temporary pits might be dug outside city walls, and extra cleaning efforts were sometimes organized once the crowds departed. Archaeology has given historians remarkable insights into these realities. When researchers excavate old medieval cesspits, they often find layers of preserved material that tell stories about daily life. Seeds from fruits, fish bones, fragments of pottery, and even lost coins sometimes appear in these deposits. Because waste pits were regularly filled and sealed, they became accidental time capsules of household activity. Through these discoveries, historians have been able to reconstruct medieval diets, trade routes, and consumption habits. The remains of imported spices or exotic fruits, for instance, can reveal connections between distant regions. Even parasites found in preserved material have helped scientists understand the health conditions people experienced. In this unusual way, the study of medieval toilets has become an important tool for learning about the past. All of this reminds us that sanitation was never just about disposal. It was closely connected to architecture, economy, environment, and health. The systems medieval people developed were shaped by the materials available to them: stone, wood, earth, flowing water, and by the limits of their knowledge. They relied on gravity, distance, and human labor rather than pipes and pumps. By the late medieval period, these accumulated experiences were slowly pushing European towns toward more organized approaches to infrastructure. Drainage channels improved, waste removal became more regular in some cities, and regulations grew more detailed. These changes were gradual and often inconsistent, but they marked the beginning of a long transition toward the urban sanitation systems that would emerge centuries later. When we step back and look at the full picture, the story of medieval toilets becomes surprisingly revealing. It shows how people coped with one of the most universal challenges of human life using the tools and knowledge they possessed. It shows communities learning, adapting, and sometimes struggling as their towns grew larger and more complex. And perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that history is not only shaped by kings, wars, and grand monuments. It is also shaped by the quiet routines of everyday life, the maintenance of a well, the cleaning of a street, the digging of a pit behind a house. These small acts of practicality allowed medieval societies to function day after day, century after century, forming the foundation upon which the modern world would eventually be built. By the closing centuries of the medieval period, the everyday routines surrounding sanitation had become deeply woven into the rhythm of urban and rural life. What had begun centuries earlier as simple solutions, pits, privies, and chamber pots, had slowly developed into a loose but recognizable system supported by workers, regulations, and shared habits. It was not a modern sanitation network, but it was a functioning framework that allowed medieval communities to survive, expand, and adapt to changing conditions. One quiet but important feature of this system was the routine labor required to keep it working. Every pit eventually filled. Every gutter collected debris. Every communal latrine required cleaning. Maintaining these structures demanded regular effort from ordinary workers whose contributions rarely appeared in chronicles or royal records. Sweepers cleared streets. Laborers dug new pits or repaired wooden privy structures. Night soil collectors removed waste from cesspits and transported it beyond town walls. These jobs were physically demanding and often unpleasant, yet they were essential for keeping towns habitable. In many ways, these workers formed the invisible foundation of medieval sanitation. Without their efforts, the daily waste of thousands of residents would quickly have overwhelmed even the best designed systems. The quiet efficiency of these routines allowed markets to operate, households to function, and travelers to move through cities without the constant obstruction of unmanaged waste. Rural communities followed a slightly different rhythm. Villages had more space, and distance itself served as an important sanitation tool. Waste pits could be placed far from wells and living areas, reducing the risk of contamination. Agricultural fields also played a role in this cycle. Organic waste mixed with straw, leaves, or animal manure could return to the soil as fertilizer. While medieval farmers did not describe the process in modern scientific terms, they understood from experience that enriched soil supported stronger harvests. This connection between waste and agriculture highlights a practical awareness of resource use that was common in pre-modern societies. Materials were rarely discarded without thought. Even scraps of cloth, ash from fires, and kitchen leftovers could find secondary uses. Human waste, though unpleasant, became part of the broader environmental cycle that supported farming and food production. Inside towns, however, the balance remained delicate. As populations continued to grow toward the end of the Middle Ages, older sanitation systems sometimes struggled to keep pace. Narrow streets, tightly packed houses, and increasing commercial activity placed constant pressure on drainage channels and cesspits. During periods of heavy rain, pits might overflow or waste could be washed into neighboring areas. In dry seasons, strong odors could linger for days. These challenges encouraged towns to refine their rules and routines. Officials might order the clearing of blocked gutters or demand that property owners repair damaged pits. In some places, communal efforts were organized to clean particularly busy streets or marketplaces. Although these measures were modest by modern standards, they reveal an increasing recognition that sanitation was not only a private concern but also a matter of shared responsibility. Public wells and fountains remained central to this effort. Protecting drinking water became one of the most important priorities for urban communities. Wells were often surrounded by stone structures to prevent surface contamination, and residents were discouraged from disposing of waste nearby. The simple act of drawing water from a clean source each day depended on maintaining these protections. Travel accounts from the later medieval period sometimes describe cities that were surprisingly orderly despite their limitations. Streets might be crowded with carts and animals, markets filled with merchants calling out their goods, and church bells marking the hours of the day. Yet beneath this busy surface lay a system of maintenance that quietly kept the environment usable. Of course, medieval sanitation was never perfect. Smells, insects, and occasional contamination were common realities of life in dense settlements. But perfection was never the goal. The goal was stability, the ability for communities to continue functioning despite the constant production of waste that came with human life. Seen from this perspective, medieval toilets and waste systems become something more meaningful than simple curiosities. They represent the everyday ingenuity of people who had to solve practical problems without the advantages of modern engineering. Using stone walls, wooden structures, flowing water, and steady labor, they created solutions that worked well enough to support towns, monasteries, castles, and villages across an entire continent. And perhaps that is the quiet lesson hidden within this topic. The Middle Ages were not simply an era of darkness or neglect, as older stereotypes sometimes suggest. They were a period of adaptation, where communities continuously adjusted their practices to match the realities of their environment and technology. In the end, something as ordinary as a medieval toilet tells us a great deal about how people lived. It reveals how architecture, labor, law, and daily habit came together to support life in a complex society. As medieval Europe slowly moved toward the end of the 15th century, the habits and systems surrounding sanitation were still evolving. Communities had centuries of experience behind them, and that experience shaped how buildings were constructed and how towns were organized. Builders, craftsmen, and householders understood that waste management was a constant necessity, something that had to be considered whenever a new house, workshop, or fortress was planned. In many towns, newer buildings were designed with slightly improved awareness of drainage and airflow. Privies were often placed toward the back of properties, away from main living areas and wells. Courtyards became useful spaces where waste pits could be located while still allowing access for cleaning and maintenance. These decisions might seem small, but together they helped reduce some of the problems that earlier generations had faced when houses were built without much planning. Castles and large manor houses also continued refining their systems. By the later medieval period, some larger residences contained multiple garderobes connected to vertical shafts within the walls. Servants were responsible for inspecting and cleaning these areas when necessary. The design allowed the noble household to maintain a level of comfort and privacy that ordinary homes could rarely achieve. Even so, the technology remained simple, relying on gravity and careful placement rather than mechanical systems. Monasteries remained among the most organized environments for sanitation. Their communal routines meant that waste management could be handled systematically. Monks followed schedules that regulated nearly every part of daily life, from meals and prayer to sleep and labor. Maintaining the cleanliness of shared facilities was considered part of the discipline of monastic living. The rear-order blocks attached to dormitories continued to function as carefully arranged communal latrines, often supported by flowing water channels where geography allowed. Meanwhile, the daily life of ordinary townspeople still revolved around simpler solutions. Chamber pots remained common in homes, particularly for nighttime use. Each morning, their contents had to be emptied into pits, drains, or designated waste areas. Families often developed routines around these tasks, treating them as just another part of the household cycle, much like preparing meals or collecting water. Urban streets continued to reflect the realities of medieval sanitation. The mixture of animals, carts, workshops, and households created constant debris. Horses and livestock left manure, market stalls generated organic waste, and households produced refuse that had to be managed carefully. Street sweepers and laborers played an ongoing role in clearing these materials so that roads remained passable. Weather still influenced conditions significantly. Heavy rain could briefly improve sanitation by washing away waste from gutters and streets. At other times, especially during dry summers, smells might linger longer in narrow urban alleys. Medieval people were accustomed to these fluctuations, and they adapted their routines accordingly. By this stage of history, another important development was beginning to take shape: a gradual awareness that cities needed more coordinated infrastructure. Although full sewer systems would not emerge until much later centuries, the foundations of urban management were slowly forming. Officials were increasingly concerned with how waste disposal affected trade, water supply, and the general reputation of a town. Merchants traveling between cities often carried impressions of the places they visited. A town with reasonably clean streets and functioning markets appeared more welcoming to traders. This practical economic incentive encouraged local authorities to pay greater attention to sanitation policies. Cleanliness was not only about comfort, it could influence commerce and the prosperity of the community. Over time, these practical concerns would contribute to the larger transformation of European cities in the centuries that followed. Renaissance urban planning, early sewer construction, and improved water systems would gradually emerge from the accumulated lessons of the medieval world. Each small improvement built upon the experience of generations who had struggled with the same basic challenges. Looking back today, it is easy to imagine medieval sanitation as crude or neglected. Yet the reality is far more nuanced. People in the Middle Ages lived within the limits of their technology, but they were not careless about their environment. They built systems that balanced practicality, labor, and available resources. They created rules, developed routines, and relied on the steady work of countless individuals to keep communities functioning. In the quiet background of medieval life, these sanitation practices supported everything else. Markets could operate because streets were maintained. Households could function because waste was managed. Monasteries could maintain their disciplined routines because infrastructure supported daily needs. And so, when we examine how people used toilets in medieval times, we are really examining the foundations of everyday life in that era. Beneath the grand stories of rulers and wars, ordinary people were constantly solving practical problems. Digging pits, building privies, clearing streets, and protecting water sources. As we look at the final pieces of this story, it becomes clear that medieval sanitation was not simply a set of crude habits, but part of a broader system of daily survival. Life in the Middle Ages required constant attention to practical details, and waste management was one of the most unavoidable of them. Every household, whether rich or poor, had to make decisions about where waste would go, how it would be removed, and how living spaces could remain tolerable in close quarters. In many ways, the medieval toilet tells us more about ordinary life than grand historical events ever could. Kings and battles appear frequently in chronicles, but the daily routines of washing, cleaning, and maintaining homes rarely receive the same attention. Yet these quiet activities shaped the experience of life far more directly than distant political events. The success of a town or household often depended on how effectively these routines were managed. The structure of medieval homes reveals this clearly. Even simple houses were arranged with some awareness of space and separation. Cooking areas, sleeping areas, storage spaces, and waste areas were usually kept apart as much as possible within the limits of small buildings. When space allowed, a privy might be placed at the far end of a yard or near the boundary of the property. This arrangement helped keep smells away from the main living space and reduced the chance of contaminating water supplies. In wealthier homes, the effort to create separation could be even more deliberate. Stone walls, enclosed courtyards, and designated service areas allowed servants to handle waste disposal without disturbing the main household. These arrangements reflected both practical concerns and social hierarchy. Maintaining comfort for the household's owners often depended on the unseen labor of those responsible for cleaning, hauling, and maintaining the less pleasant parts of domestic life. Over time, medieval communities also developed a shared understanding of responsibility. A poorly maintained cesspit or a blocked gutter did not only affect one household. It could spread foul smells, attract insects, and interfere with the movement of carts and pedestrians. Because of this, neighbors often had a collective interest in keeping their surroundings reasonably clean. Informal pressure from neighbors could sometimes be just as powerful as official regulations in encouraging better sanitation practices. Seasonal rhythms influenced these efforts as well. Spring cleaning was not only a modern concept. Warmer months encouraged households to clear out accumulated waste, repair wooden structures, and dig new pits if older ones had filled. Harvest seasons brought increased agricultural activity, which sometimes allowed organic waste to be carried out to fields where it could eventually break down. Winter created different challenges. Frozen ground made digging new pits difficult, and colder weather encouraged people to rely more heavily on chamber pots indoors. Streets might become muddy rather than dusty, and drainage systems had to cope with melting snow or ice. Medieval sanitation, like so many aspects of life in that era, required flexibility as the seasons changed. Another quiet but important feature of these systems was knowledge passed through experience rather than written instruction. Most people learned sanitation habits from parents, neighbors, or employers. Children growing up in villages or towns watched adults empty chamber pots, clean yards, or maintain pits. Over time, these routines became second nature, part of the everyday skills needed to maintain a household. This informal transmission of knowledge helped maintain continuity across generations. Even when populations grew or towns expanded, the basic practices of managing waste remained familiar. People understood where pits should be dug, how far they should be from wells, and when they needed to be emptied or replaced. When we examine these details together, a more balanced image of the medieval world begins to appear. Rather than a chaotic or careless society, we see communities constantly adjusting to the practical realities of their environment. Their solutions were simple by modern standards, but they were thoughtful responses to the challenges of living in dense towns or isolated villages without advanced technology. The medieval toilet, then, becomes a symbol of adaptation. It reflects how people used the materials available to them: earth, wood, stone, water, and human labor, to solve a universal problem. These systems required effort and cooperation, but they allowed communities to function for centuries before the arrival of modern plumbing. And perhaps that is the most revealing part of this story. When we step away from the dramatic images of castles and battlefields, we begin to see the quiet infrastructure that supported everyday life. Beneath the visible structures of medieval society lay countless small routines: cleaning streets, digging pits, hauling waste, that kept towns and villages working. These ordinary efforts rarely appear in the grand narratives of history, yet they formed the foundation upon which everything else depended. Without them, the crowded markets, busy workshops, and growing cities of medieval Europe could never have existed. In the end, understanding how people used toilets in medieval times is really about understanding how societies endure. It shows us how ordinary people, working with limited tools and knowledge, built systems that allowed entire communities to live together day after day across generations. And in that quiet persistence, as we reach the final reflections on this subject, it becomes clear that the story of medieval toilets is really a story about how people organized everyday life in a world without modern conveniences. The Middle Ages were filled with grand structures: cathedrals, castles, fortified towns. But beneath those impressive buildings existed a quieter network of routines that made daily living possible. Waste management was one of those routines. It rarely appeared in chronicles or royal records, yet it shaped the experience of life for nearly everyone. What makes medieval sanitation so interesting is the balance between simplicity and necessity. The tools were basic: pits dug into soil, wooden or stone seats, chamber pots kept near beds, and drainage channels guiding water away from buildings. There were no pumps, pipes, or treatment plants. Everything relied on gravity, distance, and steady human labor. Yet these systems worked well enough to support entire communities for centuries. The key to their success was routine. Medieval households understood that sanitation required constant attention. Pits had to be monitored and eventually replaced. Chamber pots had to be emptied each morning. Streets needed sweeping, especially in towns where animals and carts passed daily. These tasks became part of the rhythm of life, much like preparing meals or gathering firewood. This rhythm was shared across social classes, though the experience varied greatly between them. A noble living in a castle might use a stone garderobe built directly into the wall of a tower, while a farmer in a rural village relied on a simple pit behind the house. Both solutions addressed the same problem using the resources available to each household. The difference lay not in the necessity of sanitation, but in the comfort and privacy surrounding it. Medieval towns, meanwhile, represented the most complex sanitation environments of the era. Within their walls, thousands of people lived, traded, and worked in close proximity. Waste from households, animals, markets, and workshops all had to be managed within limited space. This pressure forced towns to develop informal systems of cooperation. Residents swept their portions of street. Workers cleared gutters and removed refuse. Local authorities issued rules designed to prevent the worst abuses of dumping and neglect. None of these measures created perfect cleanliness. Medieval streets could still be muddy, noisy, and filled with strong odors, especially during crowded market days or hot summer weather. But perfection was not the goal. The goal was function. As long as streets remained passable, water remained drinkable, and waste could be removed faster than it accumulated, the system succeeded. Environmental awareness also played a quiet role in these practices. People recognized that wells must be protected from contamination and that waste pits needed distance from water sources. Rivers and streams were often used as natural drainage systems, carrying waste away from populated areas. Although this sometimes created pollution downstream, it reflected a practical understanding of how flowing water could assist with sanitation. Archaeological research has deepened our understanding of these systems in surprising ways. Excavations of medieval cesspits have revealed preserved seeds, bones, and fragments of daily life that were discarded centuries ago. These discoveries provide historians with detailed information about diet, trade, and health. In some cases, even microscopic traces of parasites have been identified, helping scientists reconstruct the medical challenges people faced. Through these studies, historians have come to see medieval sanitation not as a sign of neglect, but as a complex set of solutions shaped by environment, technology, and experience. People observed what worked and what failed. Over generations, they adjusted building designs, improved drainage, and created routines that made life in towns and villages more manageable. These small improvements slowly laid the groundwork for later developments. By the end of the medieval period, many cities were already thinking more carefully about infrastructure. Streets were widened, drainage channels reinforced, and rules about waste disposal became more detailed. These steps were modest compared to modern sewer systems, but they represented the beginning of a long transformation. In the centuries that followed, growing populations and new engineering knowledge would eventually lead to underground sewer networks and piped water systems. Those advances did not appear suddenly. They grew out of the practical lessons learned during earlier periods, including the Middle Ages. And that brings us back to the humble medieval toilet itself. At first glance, it seems like a minor detail, perhaps even an amusing curiosity. But when we look more closely, it reveals a great deal about how medieval society functioned. It shows how architecture, labor, law, and environment all intersected in the daily effort to keep communities livable. The Middle Ages were not only defined by kings, wars, and grand religious buildings. They were also defined by the ordinary actions of millions of people maintaining their homes, streets, and shared spaces. In those quiet routines, digging pits, cleaning gutters, hauling waste, we see the practical intelligence that allowed medieval communities to endure. So the next time we imagine life in a medieval town or castle, it is worth remembering this hidden layer of history. Beneath the towers and stone walls existed an entire system of everyday work that kept society functioning. As we take a final, slower look at medieval sanitation, it helps to remember that the systems people relied on were part of a much larger pattern of daily life. The Middle Ages were built around routine, repetition, and practical knowledge passed from one generation to the next. Whether someone lived in a remote village or inside the walls of a busy city, the work of maintaining a livable environment never really stopped. Waste had to be moved, water had to be protected, and living spaces had to remain usable despite the constant pressures of daily activity. For villagers, this balance was often easier to maintain. A small rural settlement might contain only a handful of households scattered across open land. In these places, distance was the simplest sanitation tool. Waste pits could be dug far from homes and wells, and when one filled, it could be covered with soil while a new pit was dug elsewhere. The surrounding fields and natural landscape helped absorb and break down organic waste over time. Life still required effort, but the lower population density meant that sanitation rarely became overwhelming. Towns were a different story. Medieval cities brought together merchants, craftsmen, laborers, animals, and travelers in tightly packed spaces. Streets were narrow, buildings leaned close together, and everyday activity produced large amounts of refuse. Markets created piles of spoiled vegetables, bones, and animal remains. Horses and carts left manure along busy roads. Workshops such as tanneries or dye houses produced waste connected to their trades. All of these elements had to be managed within the limits of the town's walls. To cope with these pressures, urban communities gradually built routines that supported sanitation. Residents might sweep the ground outside their homes each morning. Street cleaners removed larger piles of debris. Carts carried waste toward dumping grounds outside the city where it could decompose or sometimes be reused in agriculture. These activities were rarely dramatic, but they formed the quiet maintenance system that allowed towns to function day after day. Another important factor was the role of water. Wells and fountains were essential sources of drinking water, and communities quickly learned that protecting them was critical. Waste pits placed too close to wells could create foul-tasting water or sickness. As a result, towns often encouraged households to place pits at safer distances and avoid disposing of refuse near these sources. While medieval people did not understand bacteria in the modern sense, They understood through experience that polluted water brought serious consequences. Within homes, the presence of chamber pots also shaped daily habits. During the night, these containers allowed people to avoid leaving the house in darkness or cold weather. In the morning, they were emptied, washed, and returned to their places. This routine became so common that it was rarely mentioned in written records, simply because it was an ordinary part of life. Architecture itself reflected these habits. Builders often placed privies near outer walls, in small yards, or in narrow projections that allowed waste to fall away from the main structure. In castles and monasteries, stone shafts carried waste downward through walls. In towns, wooden privies might stand over pits that required occasional emptying. These designs show how sanitation influenced even the layout of buildings. Over centuries, these practices created a kind of informal infrastructure. It was not centralized or technologically advanced, but it was widely understood. Most people knew how to manage household waste, how to maintain a pit, and how to keep their immediate surroundings reasonably clean. Knowledge spread through observation and daily experience rather than written manuals. The importance of this quiet infrastructure becomes clearer when we consider what would happen without it. A town where waste was ignored would quickly become unlivable. Streets would clog, wells would spoil, and disease would spread more easily. The simple routines of sanitation prevented these outcomes, often without anyone consciously recognizing their significance. In that sense, medieval toilets and waste systems represent one of the hidden foundations of society. They supported everything else: trade, agriculture, religion, and family life. Without them, the bustling markets, crowded workshops, and lively town squares of medieval Europe could not have existed. When historians study these details today, they gain a deeper understanding of the medieval world beyond its famous events. The story of sanitation reveals the practical intelligence of people who worked within the limits of their time. Using wood, stone, soil, flowing water, and human labor, they built solutions that allowed communities to endure for generations. So while a medieval toilet may appear humble, it offers a surprisingly clear window into the past. It reminds us that history is not only shaped by dramatic moments or powerful leaders. It is also shaped by ordinary routines carried out quietly every day. And through those routines, medieval societies managed to sustain themselves, adapt to change, and lay the groundwork for the more complex sanitation systems that would emerge in the centuries ahead. As we continue looking more closely at everyday life in the Middle Ages, it becomes clear that sanitation was not simply about removing waste. It was tied to ideas of order, responsibility, and the shared space people lived in. Medieval communities, whether large cities or small villages, depended on cooperation. One person's actions could affect many others, especially in crowded environments where homes, markets, and workshops existed side by side. In towns especially, neighbors lived extremely close to one another. Wooden houses often leaned over narrow streets, and upper floors sometimes extended outward above the road. With so many people sharing such limited space, small sanitation problems could quickly grow larger if ignored. A blocked drain or neglected pit could affect several nearby households at once. Because of this, people gradually developed expectations about how each resident should care for their surroundings. Local officials sometimes reinforced these expectations with simple regulations. Records from several medieval European towns show rules instructing residents not to leave refuse in public walkways or near communal wells. Other regulations required householders to maintain their privies and pits so they would not overflow into neighboring properties. While these rules were not always perfectly enforced, they demonstrate an understanding that sanitation was a collective concern. Markets were one of the places where this shared responsibility became most visible. Medieval markets were lively and crowded spaces where farmers, traders, and townspeople gathered to buy and sell goods. Animals were brought in for trade, food was prepared and sold, and waste accumulated quickly throughout the day. At the end of trading hours, vendors often had to clear away leftover scraps, spoiled produce, or animal remains. Cleaning these spaces was necessary to ensure that the market could reopen the next morning. Seasonal rhythms also shaped how waste was managed. During harvest time, villages and towns saw an increase in agricultural activity, and organic waste from crops could sometimes be reused as fertilizer. During winter, frozen ground made digging new pits difficult, so people relied more heavily on existing facilities. Snow and rain could help wash away some refuse, but they also created muddy conditions that required additional cleaning. Despite the limitations of medieval technology, people were constantly adjusting their practices to meet these challenges. A household might move its pit farther from a well after noticing changes in water quality. A town council might order the clearing of a clogged drainage channel that caused flooding in the streets. Over time, these small adjustments accumulated into broader patterns of sanitation management. The relationship between sanitation and health also began to attract attention. Medieval medical theory often linked illness to foul air or unpleasant smells. Although this idea was not scientifically accurate in the modern sense, it still encouraged efforts to reduce odors and remove decaying material from populated areas. People believed that cleaner air contributed to healthier living conditions, so removing waste became part of maintaining the well-being of the community. Another important element was the role of labor. Behind every functioning sanitation system were workers performing difficult tasks. Street sweepers removed debris from busy roads. Laborers dug pits or repaired wooden privies. Waste collectors transported refuse beyond town walls. These workers rarely appeared in written chronicles, yet their efforts supported the daily functioning of medieval society. Archaeological discoveries have helped bring these hidden aspects of life into clearer view. Excavations of old cesspits have uncovered layers of household waste preserved for centuries. Within these deposits, researchers have found seeds, fish bones, fragments of pottery, and other objects that reveal what people ate and used in their homes. In this way, even discarded materials have become valuable historical evidence. These discoveries remind us that sanitation was closely connected to many other aspects of life: diet, trade, household organization, and urban development. What people threw away often tells historians as much about their lives as the objects they carefully preserved. When we step back and consider the full picture, the medieval toilet becomes a symbol of practical problem solving. It represents how people adapted to their environment using the tools and knowledge available to them. With simple materials such as wood, stone, soil, and flowing water, they created systems that allowed communities to function long before modern plumbing existed. The systems were imperfect, and medieval cities could certainly be unpleasant places at times. But they were also places of innovation and adaptation, where people learned through experience how to manage the challenges of crowded living. Each pit, gutter, and privy formed part of a larger effort to maintain stability in a complex and growing society. In the quiet background of medieval history, these everyday systems carried out their work without recognition. They allowed markets to open each morning, families to live together in close quarters, and towns to expand into thriving centers of trade and culture. And through these ordinary routines, we gain a deeper understanding of how the medieval world truly operated. As medieval communities continued to grow and adapt, sanitation remained one of the quiet forces shaping how towns and villages developed. It influenced where buildings were placed, how streets were laid out, and even how communities thought about shared responsibility. Although people at the time did not have the language of public health that we use today, they clearly recognized that the cleanliness of their surroundings affected comfort, trade, and everyday life. One place where this awareness became particularly visible was around city gates and outer districts. Because waste was often carried outside the walls for disposal, the land beyond town gates sometimes became areas where refuse accumulated or where dumping pits were located. These spaces served a practical purpose. They allowed the crowded center of the town to remain more manageable while keeping waste at a distance from homes, markets, and wells. Farmers living nearby sometimes collected organic material from these areas to use in fertilizing fields, creating a cycle in which urban waste returned to rural agriculture. Inside the city itself, narrow streets often functioned as shared living spaces rather than simply passageways. Children played there, merchants moved goods through them, and neighbors interacted daily. Because of this constant activity, even small sanitation problems became noticeable very quickly. A blocked gutter could cause water and waste to pool in the road, making movement difficult for carts and pedestrians alike. Clearing these blockages became a regular responsibility for residents or hired workers. Many medieval streets were built with a slight slope, allowing rainwater to carry smaller debris towards central drainage channels. These gutters did not create the kind of underground sewage systems familiar in modern cities, but they did help manage the mixture of rain, mud, and waste that collected in busy areas. During heavy rains, the streets themselves sometimes acted as temporary cleaning systems as water flowed downhill and washed away loose material. Another quiet influence on sanitation was the daily rhythm of household life. Medieval homes were busy environments where cooking, storage, craft work, and sleeping all took place within limited space. Keeping such spaces livable required constant attention. Floors had to be swept, scraps removed, and containers emptied regularly. Chamber pots, once used, were washed and returned to their places for the next night. These routines were rarely written down because they were simply understood as part of responsible household management. Servants and apprentices often carried out many of these tasks in larger households. Their duties included cleaning courtyards, removing waste from pits, and maintaining privies. Although such work could be unpleasant, it was essential for maintaining the comfort of those living in the home. In this way, sanitation was closely tied to the structure of medieval labor, with different social groups contributing in different ways to the upkeep of living spaces. Religion also influenced attitudes toward cleanliness in subtle ways. Monastic communities emphasized discipline and order, and these values extended to the maintenance of their buildings. Regular routines of cleaning and careful architectural planning helped keep monastic environments relatively organized. While the primary focus of monastic life was spiritual practice, the practical management of shared living spaces was also considered important for maintaining harmony within the community. Over centuries, these habits and expectations slowly shaped the physical landscape of medieval Europe. Town councils refined their regulations, builders adjusted their designs, and households passed down practical knowledge from one generation to the next. The changes were gradual and often uneven, but they formed a continuous process of adaptation. Looking back, the medieval toilet may seem like a minor detail in the larger story of history, yet it represents one of the most universal aspects of human life. Every society must develop ways to manage waste, protect water, and maintain living spaces. The methods medieval people created were shaped by the materials they had: wood, stone, soil, and water, and by the knowledge gained through daily experience. Through these systems, communities found ways to support growing populations long before the invention of modern plumbing. The work was constant and often invisible, carried out quietly in courtyards, alleyways, and the edges of fields. But without it, the thriving towns, monasteries, and castles of the medieval world could never have functioned. And so, when we study how people used toilets in medieval times, we are really examining the hidden infrastructure of everyday life. Beneath the towers, markets, and church bells existed a network of routines and responsibilities that kept society running. It was not glamorous work, but it was essential. Through these humble systems, medieval communities managed the practical realities of living together, laying the groundwork for the more advanced sanitation systems that would eventually shape the modern world. As we continue exploring this quieter side of medieval life, it becomes clear that sanitation was deeply tied to the rhythm of community cooperation. Medieval towns were not anonymous places the way many modern cities can feel today. People knew their neighbors, worked alongside them, and shared many of the same spaces every day. Because of this closeness, maintaining a livable environment often depended on informal agreements as much as official rules. For example, many neighborhoods developed their own expectations about cleanliness. If a household allowed waste to accumulate in a shared alley or courtyard, the smell and inconvenience affected everyone nearby. Neighbors would often pressure the household to address the problem, sometimes long before any town official became involved. These quiet social pressures helped maintain a basic level of sanitation even when formal enforcement was limited. Guilds and trade groups also played a role in shaping how waste was handled. Many medieval crafts produced specific types of refuse. Butchers, for instance, generated animal remains, while tanners worked with hides that produced strong odors during processing. To reduce disruption within crowded towns, These trades were often grouped in particular districts or placed near rivers, where waste could be washed away more easily. Over time, entire neighborhoods became associated with certain trades, partly because of the sanitation challenges they created. Markets required especially careful management. On a busy market day, hundreds of people might gather in a single square. Livestock, carts, food stalls, and merchants filled the space from morning until evening. By the end of the day, the ground could be covered with scraps of vegetables, fruit peels, bones, and other waste from trade and meals. Town authorities often required vendors to clean their stalls before leaving, ensuring the market could reopen the following morning without unpleasant conditions lingering. Another subtle feature of medieval sanitation involved lighting and safety at night. Streets were dark, and walking outside after sunset could be risky or inconvenient. This made chamber pots an important part of household life. Instead of traveling through narrow streets in darkness, people could use these containers indoors and empty them later in daylight. While simple, this practice reduced nighttime hazards and kept people within the safety of their homes. When morning arrived, the day's sanitation routines began again. Chamber pots were emptied, courtyards swept, and refuse gathered for disposal. These tasks were often among the first chores of the day, completed before markets opened and daily work began. Over time, these habits became such an ordinary part of life that they rarely appeared in written descriptions. The medieval relationship with water also reveals practical awareness. Rivers, streams, and wells were essential for survival, and communities learned to treat these resources with caution. Wells were sometimes covered or surrounded by stone to prevent contamination. Buckets used for drawing water were kept relatively clean because everyone relied on the same source. In some towns, specific areas were designated for washing clothes or animals so that drinking water remained protected. These small practices show how sanitation blended into the broader culture of medieval life. Cleanliness was not approached through modern scientific understanding, but through observation and shared experience. If certain habits kept wells cleaner or streets more usable, those habits gradually became traditions passed down through generations. Archaeological discoveries continue to reveal how these routines shaped daily life. Excavations of medieval courtyards and streets often uncover drainage channels carved into stone or wood-lined pits used for waste collection. These findings confirm that sanitation was not left entirely to chance. Builders and residents clearly invested effort into managing the practical challenges of urban living. Historians studying these remains often emphasize how adaptable medieval communities were. When a system stopped working, perhaps a pit filled too quickly or a drain clogged repeatedly, people adjusted their approach. They might dig a new pit, deepen a drainage channel, or relocate a privy farther from the house. Over time, these adjustments accumulated into practical knowledge about what worked best. This adaptability was essential for towns that continued to grow throughout the later Middle Ages. Expanding populations placed increasing pressure on sanitation systems, forcing communities to refine their methods. The lessons learned during this period would eventually influence later developments in urban planning and public health. When viewed from a distance, medieval sanitation may appear primitive compared to modern plumbing and sewer systems. Yet within the context of the time, these solutions represented thoughtful responses to complex challenges. People worked with the tools they had: earth, wood, stone, water, and labor, and created systems that allowed communities to function. In the end, the medieval toilet is more than a curiosity about the past. It is a reminder that every society must solve the same basic problems of daily life. Food must be grown, water must be protected, and waste must be removed. Medieval communities managed these tasks through cooperation, habit, and steady work carried out quietly each day. As we continue reflecting on sanitation in the medieval world, it is worth remembering that the systems people relied on were deeply connected to how they understood their environment. Medieval people lived much closer to natural cycles than most modern societies do today. Rain, wind, soil, and flowing water all played a role in how waste was managed. Without mechanical systems or chemical treatment, communities depended on these natural forces to help break down and carry away what they produced. Rain, for instance, was often seen as helpful in maintaining cleaner streets. In many towns, the layout of roads allowed rainwater to flow through shallow channels or gutters. When storms passed through, the water could wash away loose dirt, food scraps, and other debris that had accumulated during busy days. This natural flushing did not remove everything, but it reduced buildup and helped keep streets usable. Wind also played an indirect role. Medieval builders often considered airflow when placing privies or waste pits. If a structure could be positioned so prevailing winds carried odors away from living areas, daily life became more comfortable. In castles and large stone buildings, small openings or external shafts allowed air to circulate through garderobes, reducing the concentration of unpleasant smells. Soil itself was an important part of sanitation. Many waste pits relied on natural decomposition within the earth. Organic materials broke down slowly over time, returning nutrients to the ground. While medieval people did not describe this process in scientific terms, they understood that buried waste gradually disappeared and that soil had the ability to absorb and transform organic matter. These environmental processes worked best in rural areas where space was abundant. Villages surrounded by farmland could maintain distance between homes, wells, and waste pits. The landscape itself provided room for disposal and natural breakdown. As long as pits were placed thoughtfully and replaced when full, sanitation remained manageable. In cities, however, these natural systems were placed under far greater strain. Large populations produced far more waste than the surrounding soil and waterways could easily absorb. This forced urban communities to rely more heavily on organized labor to remove waste beyond city walls. Carts carrying refuse were a common sight on roads leading out of town, especially during early morning hours when traffic was lighter. These journeys often ended in fields or dumping grounds where waste could eventually decompose or be used to enrich agricultural land. Although unpleasant, this process created a link between urban and rural environments. The waste produced by city life could ultimately contribute to the fertility of nearby farmland. Another element that shaped medieval sanitation was time. Unlike modern systems designed for continuous flow, medieval methods often worked in cycles. A pit might be used for months or years before being filled and sealed. Streets might accumulate debris during dry weather and then be partially cleared by heavy rains. Waste removal teams might visit certain districts on particular days. These rhythms required patience and planning. Households needed to anticipate when a pit would become full or when a drainage channel needed clearing. Workers responsible for waste removal had to coordinate their efforts with the daily movement of people and goods through town streets. Even within homes, time played a role. Morning routines often included emptying chamber pots and cleaning living spaces before other work began. These quiet tasks prepared the household for the day ahead and ensured that shared areas remained comfortable. Over centuries, these repeated actions created a pattern of sanitation practices that people rarely questioned. They were simply part of how life functioned. Children grew up observing adults perform these tasks and eventually learned to carry them out themselves. Modern historians sometimes describe this process as a form of practical knowledge, skills and habits developed through experience rather than formal instruction. Medieval sanitation was built upon this kind of knowledge. Communities experimented, adapted, and passed down what they learned. This perspective helps explain why medieval sanitation, though simple in technology, could support communities for so long. The systems were flexible and could be adjusted when conditions changed. If a drainage channel clogged, it could be cleared. If a pit filled too quickly, a new one could be dug. Solutions were rarely permanent, but they were adaptable. In the end, the story of medieval toilets is really about how societies solve everyday problems using the resources they have. People in the Middle Ages did not possess modern plumbing, yet they still found ways to manage waste, protect water, and maintain their homes and streets. Their solutions relied on cooperation, environmental awareness, and steady labor. Though often overlooked in traditional history, these quiet systems formed the foundation of daily life. Without them, the bustling markets, thriving villages, and fortified cities of medieval Europe could never have sustained their populations. And so, in something as ordinary as a medieval toilet, we see a reflection of the broader human effort to create order and stability in the places we live. As we move toward the quiet closing of this story, it helps to pause and imagine what the everyday experience of sanitation actually felt like for someone living in the medieval world. History often focuses on dramatic moments, crowns, wars, and famous rulers, but the majority of medieval life unfolded in far more ordinary ways. People woke early, prepared food, tended animals or trades, and cared for their homes. And woven quietly into all of those routines were the small but essential tasks of keeping their surroundings livable. For a family living in a medieval town, the day might begin with the first light entering through small windows or wooden shutters. Before the marketplace became busy and before the noise of carts and animals filled the street, household chores began. One of those tasks was often the emptying of chamber pots used during the night. The contents were carried carefully to a pit, a drain, or a designated waste area. The container itself would then be rinsed and returned to its place for the next evening. Courtyards and doorways were swept to remove scraps of straw, food remains, or dirt tracked inside by shoes and animals. In wealthier homes, this work might be done by servants or apprentices, But in most households, the responsibility fell directly on the family itself. These small acts of cleaning helped prevent unpleasant smells and made cramped living spaces more comfortable for everyone sharing them. Outside, the street gradually came to life. Market vendors arrived to prepare their stalls, bringing baskets of vegetables, fruit, fish, or meat. Horses and carts moved along the road, delivering goods to workshops or warehouses. With this activity came the inevitable mixture of mud, manure, and debris that defined many medieval streets. Sweepers and laborers often followed behind the busiest areas, clearing the ground so that the marketplace could remain usable. Meanwhile, wells and fountains became gathering points for water collection. Residents arrived with buckets and jugs, drawing water needed for cooking, washing, and drinking. Protecting these water sources was always important. Communities understood from experience that polluted water could make people sick, even if they did not know the exact reasons why. As a result, wells were often carefully maintained and kept separate from waste areas whenever possible. Throughout the day, these sanitation practices continued quietly in the background. Waste from kitchens was carried away. Pits were checked to ensure they had not filled too quickly. If necessary, workers transported refuse beyond the town walls where it could decompose or be used in nearby fields. None of this activity was dramatic, yet it formed the invisible infrastructure that allowed medieval towns to function. In rural villages, the rhythm was slightly different, but the principles were much the same. With more open space available, pits could be placed farther from homes, and the surrounding land absorbed much of the waste naturally. Farmers working their fields often reused organic waste to enrich the soil. In this way, sanitation and agriculture were connected parts of the same environmental cycle. Castles and monasteries, with their larger populations and enclosed structures, required more deliberate planning. Stone garderobes built into castle walls allowed waste to drop away from living quarters, while monastic reredoors used flowing water to carry waste from communal latrines. These designs reflected careful thought about how to manage sanitation within confined architectural spaces. Across all of these settings, village, town, castle, and monastery, the same principle appears again and again. Medieval sanitation relied on routine rather than technology. It depended on steady labor, shared responsibility, and practical knowledge passed from one generation to the next. Modern plumbing systems hide most of this process from view. Water flows through pipes, waste disappears underground, and complex treatment systems operate far from the places where people live. In the Middle Ages, however, sanitation remained visible. People were constantly aware of the tasks required to keep their environment clean and their water safe. Yet, despite these challenges, medieval communities endured for centuries. Towns grew into thriving centers of trade. Villages supported agriculture across vast landscapes. Monasteries and castles maintained their populations within carefully planned walls. All of this was possible because people continually managed the practical realities of daily life. And so the story of medieval toilets, simple though it may seem, offers a surprisingly honest view of the past. It reveals a world where survival depended not only on political power or military strength, but also on the quiet discipline of everyday routines. In the end, the Middle Ages were sustained by millions of ordinary actions: digging pits, sweeping streets, protecting wells, and maintaining the small structures that handled waste. Through these modest efforts, communities created livable spaces in a world without modern infrastructure. And perhaps that is the most enduring lesson of this history. Long before pipes and sewage systems transformed cities, people were already finding ways to live together, adapting to their environment and solving the same basic challenges every human society must face. As we come to the very end of this exploration, it's worth stepping back and seeing the larger picture that medieval sanitation reveals. Toilets, pits, and privies might seem like minor details in the grand story of history, yet they quietly shaped the daily reality of millions of people. Every medieval household, whether inside a crowded city or on a quiet farm, had to manage the same unavoidable human need. And the way they solved that need tells us a great deal about how their world functioned. In medieval society, comfort and cleanliness were never completely separated from the environment. Unlike the sealed plumbing systems we rely on today, sanitation in the Middle Ages remained closely connected to the surrounding landscape. Soil absorbed waste. Rain washed away debris. Rivers carried refuse beyond the edges of towns. Airflow helped disperse odors from buildings. Human labor filled the gaps wherever nature alone was not enough. This constant interaction with the environment meant that medieval people developed a practical awareness of their surroundings. A poorly placed pit could spoil a well. A blocked drain could flood a street. A neglected market square could become unpleasant for traders and customers alike. Through observation and experience, communities slowly learned how to avoid these problems. They placed wells carefully, kept waste pits at a distance, and cleared gutters when they became clogged. The solutions were rarely perfect, but they were functional. Medieval towns did not aim for the spotless cleanliness that modern sanitation systems attempt to achieve. Instead, their goal was balance, keeping waste under control so that daily life could continue without constant disruption. That balance depended heavily on human effort. Sweepers, waste collectors, servants, and laborers all played important roles in maintaining the basic infrastructure of sanitation. Their work often went unnoticed in historical records, yet without it medieval cities could not have supported the busy markets, workshops, and households that defined urban life. Architecture also played a crucial role in shaping sanitation practices. Builders incorporated privies into walls, constructed pits in courtyards, and designed drainage channels along streets. In castles, garderobes allowed waste to fall away from the living quarters of nobles and guards. In monasteries, communal latrines connected to flowing water systems reflected the careful organization of religious life. Even small objects such as chamber pots tell us something about the medieval world. They reveal how households adapted to the challenges of darkness, cold weather, and crowded living spaces. A simple ceramic or wooden container placed beside the bed was not just a convenience. It was part of a larger system that allowed people to manage daily life safely and efficiently. Over centuries, these practical arrangements gradually improved as communities gained experience. Town councils refined their regulations about waste disposal. Builders adjusted the placement of wells and privies. workers developed routines for removing refuse beyond the city walls. These small adjustments accumulated into a form of practical knowledge that shaped how medieval settlements operated. Eventually, these lessons helped prepare the way for later developments in sanitation. When early modern cities began experimenting with more organized drainage systems and eventually underground sewers, they built upon the practical understanding developed during the medieval period. The solutions of the Middle Ages were not the final stage of sanitation, but they were an essential step in its long evolution. Perhaps the most important thing this topic reveals is the resilience of everyday life. Medieval people lived without the conveniences we take for granted today. No running water, no flush toilets, no hidden networks of pipes beneath the streets. Yet through cooperation, observation, and steady labor, they created systems that allowed communities to endure for generations. Their towns bustled with trade. Their villages supported agriculture across wide landscapes. Their monasteries maintained disciplined communities devoted to study and prayer. Beneath all of these activities lay the quiet work of sanitation. Digging pits, sweeping streets, protecting wells, and removing waste day after day. In that sense, the medieval toilet is more than a historical curiosity. It is a reminder that civilization depends not only on great achievements but also on humble routines. The systems that keep societies functioning are often the ones we notice the least. So when we imagine the Middle Ages, its castles rising above stone walls, its markets filled with voices and movement, it is worth remembering the hidden work that made those scenes possible. Behind every crowded street and busy household stood the simple, practical solutions people created to manage the realities of human life. And through those quiet solutions, medieval society carried on century after century, long before the arrival of the modern sanitation systems that now shape our world. And yet, perhaps the most interesting part of this story is how completely ordinary it all was to the people living through it. Medieval sanitation was not something most people thought about in abstract terms. It was simply part of life, woven into the same routines as cooking, farming, trading, and caring for a household. Just as people today rarely think about the pipes hidden behind their walls, medieval families accepted their own systems as normal, even if they required more visible effort. Imagine walking through a medieval town in the early morning. The streets would still be quiet compared with the busy hours ahead. Shop shutters might be opening, smoke beginning to rise from kitchen hearths, and the first carts entering the town gate carrying produce from nearby farms. In courtyards and narrow alleys, household chores were already underway. Floors were being swept, scraps collected, and containers emptied. These quiet moments reveal something important about medieval sanitation. It was continuous work. There was no single moment when a system finished its job. Waste removal was a cycle that repeated every day, every week, and every season. Pits filled and were replaced. Streets accumulated debris and were cleaned again. Water sources were protected again and again through daily habits. In many ways, the medieval world functioned through these repeating patterns. Stability came not from complex machines but from predictable routines carried out by many different people. A town did not stay livable because of one grand engineering project. It stayed livable because hundreds or thousands of residents each performed small tasks that contributed to the whole. Another aspect that often surprises modern historians is how adaptable these communities were. Medieval towns were constantly changing. Fires destroyed neighborhoods and forced rebuilding. Populations grew or shrank depending on trade and agriculture. Wars or plagues sometimes disrupted entire regions. Yet sanitation practices adjusted alongside these changes. If a town expanded and an old dumping ground became too close to new houses, another site could be chosen farther away. If a well became contaminated, residents might dig a new one or reinforce protections around the water source. If a market grew larger and produced more waste, cleaning routines might be expanded to keep the area usable. These adjustments were rarely planned by engineers in the modern sense. Instead, they emerged from observation and necessity. People paid attention to what worked and what caused problems, and over time they refined their habits accordingly. Even the language of the time reflected this practical mindset. Many medieval records discuss fines for dumping waste in the wrong places or failing to maintain privies. These rules were not written out of abstract theory. They came from direct experience. Someone had seen a street blocked, a well spoiled, or a market disrupted, and the community responded by creating a rule to prevent the same problem from happening again. Seen this way, medieval sanitation becomes a kind of quiet social contract. Each household took responsibility for its own waste while also respecting the shared spaces of the town. Neighbors relied on each other to maintain these expectations because the consequences of neglect were immediately visible. Over centuries, these habits helped shape the physical appearance of medieval settlements. Streets developed drainage channels. Courtyards contained pits or waste areas. Buildings included small projections or chambers designed for privies. Even the edges of towns were shaped by the constant movement of refuse being carried beyond the walls. All of these features formed part of an informal infrastructure, one that existed long before modern sewer systems or municipal sanitation departments. It was built through labor, custom, and local knowledge rather than centralized engineering. Perhaps the most valuable lesson from this history is the reminder that human societies have always been problem solvers. Even without advanced technology, medieval communities found ways to manage the essential challenges of daily life. They observed their surroundings, learned from mistakes, and gradually improved the systems they depended on. The medieval toilet, humble as it may appear, represents one small piece of that broader story. It reminds us that history is not only about grand monuments or dramatic events. It is also about the countless ordinary decisions people make in order to live together. Every pit dug behind a house, every street swept after a market day, every bucket of waste carried beyond the town gate. These actions formed the quiet foundation of medieval society. And when we look closely at those foundations, we begin to see the Middle Ages not as a distant or mysterious era, but as a world of practical people doing what humans have always done, adapting to their environment, solving everyday problems, and building communities that could endure.